The night Daniel slept with his wife's younger sister, his wife Mary was in the next room bleeding after childbirth, too weak to even sit upright, yet fully conscious of every sound coming from the other side of the wall. Earlier that same day, Mary had gone into labor just after sunrise. The pain started slowly, but within an hour it became unbearable, the kind that forces the body to fold into itself. She called out to Daniel, her voice shaking, asking him to take her to the hospital because something didn't feel right. This time was different. The pain was sharper, deeper, and constant. But Daniel barely looked at her. He sat there, irritated, as if her suffering was an inconvenience rather than an emergency. He reminded her that she had already given birth 3 times before and told her to stop acting dramatic. When another contraction hit and she screamed, he stood up. Not to help, but to leave the house. He told her to handle it and walked out, abandoning her at the exact moment she needed him most. Mary labored alone for hours. There was no nurse, no neighbor, no help. Just her body fighting through wave after wave of pain while her strength slowly drained away. By the time the baby finally came, she was barely conscious. It was another girl. The 4th. But there was no time to even process that because the bleeding didn't stop. It kept flowing in a way that was not normal, soaking through everything beneath her, making her feel lightheaded and cold. She knew something was wrong, but she had no strength left to do anything about it. Daniel returned later that afternoon. The first thing he asked was not about her condition, not about whether she survived the delivery, but about the child. The moment he heard it was a girl, something in him snapped. His face hardened, and without even stepping closer to look at the baby, he muttered in disgust. To him, it was not just another child, it was another failure. He started pacing, anger building with every step, complaining about how a man could not build a legacy with daughters alone. Mary tried to speak, tried to explain that she needed help, that she was still bleeding, but he ignored her completely. Daniel pointed toward the visitor's room and told her to go and clean it. At first, she thought he wasn't serious. She could barely lift her head, let alone stand. But his tone changed, becoming colder, more threatening. He repeated himself, and something in his voice made it clear that this was not a request. Somehow, Mary forced herself up. Her legs trembled under her weight, and she had to hold onto the wall to keep from collapsing. With every step she took, she felt blood leaving her body, but she kept going. Slowly, painfully, she made her way to that room and began to clean. She cleaned in silence, her body weakening with each movement. By evening, Daniel returned again. This time, he was not alone. He came back with Ruth, Mary's younger sister. The sight of her standing there felt unreal. This was the same girl Mary had protected, supported, and treated like her own child growing up. But there was something different about her now. She didn't look concerned. She didn't look surprised. She looked calm, almost prepared. Daniel didn't waste time explaining. He made it obvious through his actions and his words. He openly declared that Ruth would give him the son Mary had failed to provide. The cruelty of it was not hidden, it was displayed without shame. Mary, still weak and barely able to stand, watched as her own sister stood there and accepted it. There was no apology, no hesitation. When Ruth finally spoke, her words cut deeper than anything Daniel had said. She told Mary plainly that not every woman is meant to give birth to sons, but she was. That night, Mary lay in the next room, her body still struggling from childbirth, while Daniel and Ruth were together in the room she had cleaned hours earlier. She could hear everything. There was no escape from it. The pain she felt was no longer just physical, it became something deeper, something that settled into her chest and refused to leave. Later that night, Daniel called out for food. Mary hadn't cooked anything. She hadn't even had the strength to sit up properly, let alone prepare a meal. But instead of understanding, Daniel became furious. He stormed into the room, grabbed her, and dragged her outside. The rain had already started falling, heavy and cold. Without any hesitation, he threw her out along with her 4 daughters and locked the door behind them. The baby on her chest was barely a few hours old, wrapped in a thin cloth that was already soaked through, and the other 3 girls clung to her wrapper, shivering, confused, too young to understand why their father had pushed them out into the night like strangers. Mary stood there for a long time, not because she didn't know where to go, but because her body refused to move. The blood loss had made her lightheaded, her legs weak, and every part of her ached in a way that was deeper than pain. Slowly, almost blindly, she began to walk. Each step felt like it might be her last, but she kept going because the alternative was to collapse in the rain and leave 4 children with nothing. They found shelter that night in an unfinished building not far from the street. The floor was cold, dusty, and damp, but it was better than the open rain. Mary sat down carefully, leaning against the wall, holding the newborn close to her chest while the other girls curled up beside her. The eldest tried to be brave, asking questions Mary could not answer, while the younger ones cried themselves to sleep. By morning, the bleeding had reduced slightly. Not gone, but enough for her to stand again. The days that followed were not dramatic, they were worse, they were quiet struggles. Hunger came first. The little money she had was gone quickly, and asking for help was not easy when people already knew her story. Some pitied her, some avoided her, and some blamed her silently, as if giving birth to daughters had been a choice she made on purpose. Mary learned quickly that survival would not come from sympathy. It would come from endurance. After days of searching, she found work at a small roadside hotel. Not the kind people go to for comfort, but the kind that stays busy because it is cheap. The owner didn't ask many questions, he just needed someone to wash plates, clean tables, and handle whatever was thrown her way. The pay was small, almost insulting, but Mary accepted it without hesitation. It meant food. It meant something. Her routine became relentless. She woke up before sunrise, tied the baby securely on her back, and walked with her daughters to the hotel. The older girls learned quickly. They helped where they could, carrying water, wiping tables, doing small tasks that no child should have to worry about, but necessity does not wait for childhood. Mary worked for hours without rest, her hands constantly in soapy water, her back aching, her body still recovering from childbirth while being pushed far beyond what it should handle. At night, they returned to a single small room she eventually managed to rent. It was cramped, poorly ventilated, and barely furnished, but it was theirs. Some nights they slept hungry. Some nights the rain found its way through the roof. But slowly, very slowly, things stabilized. The bleeding stopped completely. Her strength returned. Not fully, but enough. Her daughters grew up watching all of this. They saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she forced herself to keep going even when her body begged her to rest. Her daughters enrolled back to school, studied hard. Education became their way out, their way of changing the story that had been written for them. They studied under dim light, shared books, wore uniforms that were patched and reused, but they never stopped. Mary couldn't give them comfort, but she gave them consistency, and that became enough. While Mary was still struggling to stabilize her life, Daniel had already moved on without looking back. Ruth settled into the house quickly, not as a guest, but as the new woman of the home. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from believing she had secured something Mary never could. Ruth became pregnant not long after she moved into the house, and from that moment everything around her changed. Daniel treated the pregnancy like a personal victory, the kind he had been waiting for all his life. He became attentive in ways he had never been with Mary, making sure Ruth rested, making sure she ate well, making sure she was seen and respected. As the pregnancy progressed, Daniel spared no expense. He made arrangements for her to be attended to at one of the most expensive hospitals he could afford, determined that nothing would go wrong this time. Everything about it was deliberate, controlled, and carefully managed, as if money and attention could guarantee the outcome he wanted. Ruth embraced it all, enjoying the comfort, the attention, and the position she now held in the house. To her, this was proof that she had stepped into a life Mary could never secure. When the day of delivery finally came, Daniel was restless with anticipation. This was the moment everything would be justified. The wait felt longer than it actually was, and when the news finally came that it was a boy, the relief and excitement were immediate. He smiled in a way he hadn't in years, convinced that everything had finally fallen into place. When he was finally allowed to see the child, something shifted. The baby was not like what he had imagined. There was a stillness to him that didn't feel right, a lack of strength in his movement, a fragility that could not be ignored. The doctor spoke carefully, explaining that the child had been born with physical limitations that would affect his growth and mobility. It was not something permanent. Daniel stood there, listening, but not fully processing. The excitement he had built up over months began to collapse quietly. This was not the son he had pictured, not the future he had planned. What he saw instead was responsibility, uncertainty, and a reality he had not prepared himself to face. Ruth's reaction was different. The same confidence she once carried began to harden into something sharper. The stress of caring for the child, combined with the shift in expectations, changed her. She became more demanding, less patient, more vocal about her frustrations. The house, which had once felt calm under Mary's quiet strength, became tense. Small issues turned into arguments. Silence turned into discomfort. Peace slowly disappeared. Mary's life continued on a completely different path. Her daughters remained focused on their education, determined to make something out of the little they had been given. The first two pushed through the hardest years and eventually graduated, securing jobs that brought some form of stability into their lives. It was not instant success, but it was enough to change things. With their support, the burden on Mary began to ease. The younger two were able to stay in school without interruption, giving opportunities that once seemed impossible. One by one, they followed the same path, completing their education and stepping into their own lives with purpose. Years of quiet sacrifice began to show results. The same girls who had once been thrown out into the rain were now building something solid, something lasting. And the first major thing they did with that success was for their mother. They came together, combined their efforts, and built her a house. Not just a place to stay, but a proper home, something she could finally call her own without fear of losing it. Daniel's life became something he no longer recognized. The house that once felt like a place of control now felt heavy, filled with responsibilities he had never prepared himself for. His son needed constant care, not occasionally, not when it was convenient, but every single day. Simple things that other children did without effort became tasks that required time, patience, and attention. There were hospital visits, therapies, sleepless nights, and a constant sense that things were not getting easier. Ruth, who had once carried herself with quiet confidence, changed completely under that pressure. She complained, she argued, she demanded more. More help, more money, more attention. The stress showed in everything she did. Daniel found himself caught in the middle of it all. Then one day, he saw something in the newspaper that stopped him completely. It was a newspaper. His eyes caught a familiar face. He looked closer, and then everything else around him seemed to fade. It was Mary. And beside her were 4 young women, standing confidently, dressed well, smiling in a way that spoke of stability and success. The headlines spoke about their achievements, their journey, their impact. His daughters. For a long moment, Daniel just stared. It didn't feel real. These were the same children he had once dismissed, the same ones he had pushed out into the rain without hesitation. Now they stood as everything he had once claimed they could never be. That evening Daniel went for a walk. And without focus, his mind occupied, his attention somewhere far from where he was. He didn't notice how close he was to the road. He didn't see the car coming. The impact was sudden, sharp, and final. By the time people gathered, by the time help arrived, it was already clear, Daniel had lost his life. The news reached Mary and her daughters not long after. For a moment, there was silence. Not shock exactly, but a pause, as if the past and present had collided in a way that needed to be understood. They went for the burial. Not out of obligation, but for closure. Mary stood there, looking at the man who had once been her husband, the man who had made a decision that changed the course of her life completely. Her daughters stood beside her, no longer the children who had been thrown out into the rain, but women who had built something strong from nothing. There was no anger in that moment. Time had taken care of that. What remained was something quieter. Mary forgave him. Not because he had asked in that moment, not because it would change anything, but because she no longer wanted to carry what he had done. Forgiveness, for her, was not about him. It was about letting go of a past that had already taken enough. But forgiveness did not mean reconnection. When it came to Ruth and the child, the decision was clear. There would be no ties, no involvement, no shared space between their lives. Some lines, once crossed, remained that way. And so they left, the same way they had come, without drama, without noise, carrying only what mattered to them. Daniel's story ended there. If you enjoyed this story, please tell us where you are watching from in the comment section. Hit the subscribe button for more stories like this.